Okay, so now it's a pleasure to introduce my colleague Simon PJ, who's, I think, sort of matured his talk as well in the course of the years and is one of the most popular elements in the school. He will give the first talk of the school and the last one as well. Today it will be on how to give a great research talk. So Simon is a principal researcher in the Programming Principle and Tools group. He's also, so his research is very much around functional programming languages. So he's worked a lot of his research life on Haskell and specifically the Glasgow Haskell compiler. Simon's also very well known. He's now the chair of the Computing at Schools Society, so he's been involved for a very long time and has been instrumental for a change in the UK school curriculum, namely making computer science a mandatory science subject in schools, which is a very great achievement here in the UK. And finally, we've been very proud that Simon was elected as Fellow of the Royal Society just this year. So please welcome Simon.
Great, thanks. Okay, good. Well, you will note from your program that, firstly, a talk about how to give a talk is a somewhat recursive endeavor, and also that the last talk of the summer school appears to be the same as the first one. So perhaps there's an infinite loop in this recursion, but actually there isn't. It's just a misprint. The last talk really is different. This is kind of about how and why we might want to give research talks. So I think it's helpful, first of all, to position it and say, what are we doing this for? I think research is about communicating with people. It's all, we have this kind of picture of people sitting in windowless rooms, staring at screens, having great ideas. But actually, for me at any rate, most research actually happens in dialogue with other people. And research talks are an important part of that dialogue. They're a sort of big part of our communication. And I'd invite you to think, you've probably been to quite a lot of research talks by now. How many times have you been to a talk when you didn't just, you sometimes say to somebody, I sat through that talk, right? I sat through 6 talks, right? How many times have you been to a talk which you didn't sit through it? You thought, I'm really glad I went to that talk. I learned something. I was interested in it. I came away a bit excited by it. Think about those talks and what was the speaker doing that made you feel excited? It probably wasn't just that. They were speaking to the precise area that you yourself was working in, though that can help. But it was probably something else about what they did or said. So I kind of like to invite you to think about that. And in particular, for this talk, what I want to try and do is to give some sort of simple, actionable ideas that I think might help you give better talks. The good news is, the general standard is not that high, so you can shine without too much trouble. And so, as Scarlett says, I'm a kind of professional researcher. I'm sort of sharing the ideas that I've had and found useful to myself. I'm not a professional communicator, so you're going to get a completely different picture from the professional coaches you talk to. But I think that dialogue also might be quite intriguing to you. Now, research is about communication, and giving talks is not about the kind of thing about which there are right answers. So it would be much more fun for me if you, instead of sitting there very politely and stoically listening to me, you would interact by asking questions or by making comments from your own experience. But don't just save them to the end. If you just sit there like bread puddings, I will feel that I have failed. So you have to help me feel that I have not failed. Okay. So. So this is the last piece about why it's worth paying attention to it, why it's worth paying attention to speaking, is that when you're speaking to, let's say, 20 or 50 or 100 people, you are consuming, 20 minutes worth or half an hour or an hour's worth of people's time. And that's the commodity which they don't have any more of. Rich or poor, we all have exactly the same number of hours in the day. So by coming to your talk, they're giving you a kind of priceless gift that they will never have to give again, which is something of their time. So it's quite important that you pay attention to it. So the first thing is, what is the purpose of your talk? If you listen to talks, you would often think this was the purpose, right? It was to sort of impress your audience with how clever you are, right? And to show them, and sometimes if you listen to a talk, you would think, this person is trying to tell me everything they know about this topic, but because it's only 20 minutes, they have compressed everything they know about the topic into a sort of tight, highly compressed bundle that nobody could understand. And that's really not what giving a talk's about. I think it's about communicating a single idea, right? So I'd like you to imagine giving the audience some intuitive feel for the idea. They don't need to have a deep technical understanding of the idea that you're presenting, but it's really good if they can go away with some intuition. So one thing I think is helpful to bear in mind is imagine that your audience contains 5 or 10% of people who really know about the topic that you're talking about, but there's another 85 or 90% who know very little about it. They may be computer scientists, they probably are computer scientists, but they're not going to know about your particular area of networking or of static analysis of pointers in programs. And you'd like all of those people to take something valuable away with them, rather than to think, this talk isn't for me, I'm going to switch off and read my email. You see the point? So you want to kind of, what can you give them that even a non-specialist in your area will take away and think is valuable to them? You want to kind of make them feel that they're glad they came. So what would make them feel that they're glad they came? Well, something that engages their interest and excitement. And so you're going to kind of convey that somehow. Now, of course, that would be easier if your audience was an easy audience. So that the audience you would like is like this. They've just jumped out of bed in the morning. They're full of vim and vigor. They have been reading your papers for the last 5 years and are eager to understand the next piece that you have to present to them. And moreover, they thoroughly understand the technical background. Of course, this isn't really what happens, right? What actually happens is they don't know you from Adam or from Eve. They don't know the technical background. And moreover, they've just had lunch. Right? So they're in that somnolent post-lunch phase in which if they're not somehow engaged, they're going to slump into a kind of doze. So your goal in a talk is to kind of wake them up and make them feel, I really want to listen to this talk, I'm going to pay attention. The other thing is you're very politely sitting, looking, I can see your eyes, right? Often when you're in a research talk in a conference, about half the audience, you won't see their eyes because they're looking at their laptops, right? They haven't been told by Scarlett not to read their email, so they will be, right? And that's not their fault, it's yours, right? So you've got to drag them out of their laptops by thinking, I'm going to find something exciting here. So I want to say a little bit about what to put into a talk and a little bit about but rather more actually, about what not to put into it. Okay, are we so far so good? Any other questions or observations so far? So what do you put into a talk? Well, perhaps quite a lot, but I would suggest not very much. So I would suggest there's 2 things. One, say something about what the motivation is. What are you trying to achieve? And then secondly, focus the whole of your talk on one key idea, and you need to know what that is. So I want to say a little bit more about both of those things. So the first thing is, what's your motivation? So when you give a talk, you have that sort of 2-minute bit at the beginning, at which every audience will give you some leeway. They will pay some attention to you at the beginning. So it's quite important to kick off quickly. So I find in quite a lot of talks I go to, I'm paying attention for the first 30 seconds, and then the speaker goes into a long riff that appears to be sort of general fluff about the beginning. I'm glad I'm here, and I came on this plane, and here's the general kind of thing I'm doing, and I kind of lose attention. So try to dive in really quickly with something that's going to engage their attention. And what is going to engage their attention? Well, if you can say something about what problem it is you're trying to solve, and then give some reason to believe that it might be an interesting and a problem that's worth solving. Because in computing, there are lots of problems, and not all of them are worth solving. Right? Novelty is not so much of interest in its own right. I'll say more of that later this week. And then it's helpful if you can give early on some indication that your talk is going to give a worthwhile step forward, not just, here is, Mount Everest, and I'm going to wander around it, but here is, a reasonable sized mountain, and by the end of the talk, I'm going to have taken you, to at least the foothills, right? So give them some preview of what they might get to if they stay with you. So here's a couple of examples. I'm going to stand back and look at these because I don't have these off by heart, right? So I'm a PL guy. So this is, Java class files are very big. Give some big figures, some brief numbers. And so the idea, what's the key idea? Maybe we can use some kind of compression technology to shrink them so they take less time to send over a network. But then maybe it could be language aware, right? If it's generic compression technology, just gzip, you might do so bad. But if you knew that you were compressing Java, maybe you could do better. Blah, blah, blah. So that's a kind of, you could think there's something vaguely plausible about that idea. And then say, actually, this idea works quite well. We can do, 30% better than gzip, and I'm going to show you how. Right, so now you've got, in a very short time, you just got a quick overview of the problem and how you're going to solve it. This was another one. How are we going to find synchronization errors in concurrent programs? Everybody knows concurrent programs, really hard to write. Lots of, race hazards when you, mutate one variable in another and read it in another. And I'm going to show you a type system. That is a kind of static analysis that's going to help you find at least some of those errors, a particular class of the errors. And there you might give an example of immediately give an example of the kind of error that you might find. Do you know what I mean? Very quick summary of what you're trying to achieve. So that was about the motivation part, right? That was the first bit. So you got that kind of 2 or 5 minutes at the beginning to gain their attention. Yes?
When you say motivation, would you say you should ideally put like a video of something cool if you have something to show in that bit? Or
Could you put a video there? Well, it would kind of depend. Yes, so that could be great, right? If it was a video demo, say that you were, I have such demo over people who do robots, right? But supposing you were a robotics person, and you could say, I've figured out a way to make a robot walk better, and you show a video that says, here was it walking before, and then, here's it walking afterwards, right? That would be highly motivating, right? So, but it somehow has to be, relevant to your talk, right? If it's just, hey, I'm showing a video, it's not so good. So. If you're the sort of person who can do videos well, absolutely go for it. But of course, remember, typically I'm thinking often of a sort of 20-minute slot in a conference, right? Or maybe half hour. It's a bit rare to get full hour talk. So videos have to be quite short to pay their way. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I actually have a comment.
Yes. Please. Comments are good.
Yeah. So I was just thinking because
Oh, can you sort of make sure everyone can hear you rather than don't just speak to me? Yeah.
So I used to work for IBM, and even though I was a technical person, everybody's supposed to sell at IBM. So it's how they train you, and they make you do presentations to all sorts of people. So I think one thing that I learned over the years was that any talk or any presentation has to be dynamic. I mean, sometimes you can prepare for hours or days, but when you arrive somewhere and you gauge the audience and the kind of people they're there, maybe what you thought was going to be motivational is totally mundane and boring for them. So I think you have to also be quite receptive on the go on what they're absorbing and whatnot, and willing to change, as you go along the presentation. I mean, it could be a video or a joke, or sometimes it could sound lame. So it depends on the audience. I think it's quite a two-way thing.
Certainly being responsive to an audience, particularly if it's a smallish audience that you can engage with, is kind of really helpful. And you should, if you need to, in the end, have the confidence to kind of give up a bit on your planned presentation and divert if necessary. But anyone else? This is good? Yeah.
I guess also the body language is really important, and we see two different people, and Sue was kind of talking not louder that much, but now you are talking and speaking louder and moving around and using your body to mimic things. It's much easier to follow you up and seeing the emotion getting out of you, and we're seeing that you are really motivated and
right. So I have quite a bit more to say about enthusiasm and presentation towards the end of this talk. So yes, how you present. So the moment we're on what to present, and we're going to get to how to. It's super important. Super important. Thank you. Okay, let's do a bit more about what. So motivation and key idea. So the key idea is really quite important, right? And when you leave a talk, here's an exercise. For every talk you go to this week, when you walk out, say, what was the key idea of that talk that I've learnt? If you can't articulate it, the speaker, not you, has failed, right? So you can try this out on my colleagues this week. It'll be quite a laugh. So, when you give a talk, try to make sure that the audience can be in no doubt what your key idea is, because really a talk is a kind of it's like a pill that you're giving. The audience is swallowing the pill, and it's carrying a payload, right, of the drug that's going to infect their system, and you want to kind of get that idea into their head so they can't think about anything else, like a sort of tune that you can't forget, right? But you have to know what the idea is, because if you don't, they certainly won't. Right? So that's why I say here, ruthlessly prune the material around the key idea. Right? So you have lots of stuff. When you give talks, you'll have been working for months on a particular talk, or maybe it's a talk about the paper. The paper has quite a lot of material in it, but somehow at the core of the paper, there's a key idea. That's what you've got to convey. Right, and everything in your talk, you don't have very long, has to be pruned around that that moment. And moreover, I think it's helpful if you're explicit about it. Sometimes you have a key idea, but the audience still doesn't get it, right? So you want to be absolutely clear. You can have slides at the top that say, this is the key idea. You can, stand on a chair and say, this is the key idea at this moment. If you remember nothing else from this talk, remember this, right? Get across the key idea and make sure that the audience know which it is. Does that make sense? Super, super important. Now, another thing that you will often see in talks is that they kind of try to cover too much, right? So I call this sort of shallow and broad rather than narrow and deep, right? So in order to position your talk, you have to say something general about the area that you're working with. But sometimes people do a sort of, a horizontal, a shallow trench that covers a lot of ground, but not in any great depth. And that's very unsatisfying. Right? What's much better, I think, is to do a short overview that positions what you're doing, and then do a sort of deep dive. I call it, producing the technical meat, right? Imagine your audience is sort of hyenas, they need something, they need red meat. So you've got to give them something substantial, and that's this sort of deep bit. Now, that means that there are other deep bits that you've dug, right, and have put a lot of attention to, that you're not going to tell them. That's okay. Right? They can get that from the paper. But you have to give them, I think part of what engages a technical audience's interest and enthusiasm, and we are talking about technical audiences, is some actual technical content, right? And it's difficult to do that because computer science is very specialized. So to take your audience in 20 minutes from 0 to some actual content in your space, you'll have to be pretty precise about what you show them and what you don't, right? You cannot show them everything. Does that make sense? Yeah, Rob.
How do you avoid this kind of problem when you're doing a cross-disciplinary talk?
Oh, when you're speaking to other people entirely, it's even harder, right? So, like if you're, this happens, I sit in this room a lot at Microsoft interview talks, and people are interviewing for permanent posts, they're asked to speak to the whole lab. So I'm listening to people who are doing machine learning, and I'm a PL guy, and I'm struggling to understand them. But nevertheless, it ought to be possible for a machine learning person to explain an idea to a PL guy, right? Even an idea in their little patch. So it's harder. It's harder. The more your audience knows about your area, the easier it is. Yeah. Okay. But I do encourage you, don't just do the we got the whiz-was system and the sort of the shallow broad thing. But in order to do this, well, how are you going to present this technical material? Well, do it by example, right? So examples are your main weapon in presenting ideas clearly. Never, in my humble suggestion, at least as a starting point, never present the theorem or the generalization first. Instead, produce an example. Do you remember when we were talking about motivation? What did I put up? A couple of examples. Right, to illustrate what I meant by motivation. And when we're talking about synchronization errors, I said, well, perhaps even at that moment when you're saying what to frame your problem, rather than talking about synchronization errors in general, you could produce a particular example of a synchronization error and put it right up there so people can get hold of it. Right? So everybody in their learning always moves from the specific to the general. And yet, extraordinarily, when we present to other people, we often try to move from the general to the specific. It's completely bonkers. Well, the way we all learn is this way, right? And so that's the way you should take your audiences. It's not universal truth, but it's a pretty good starting point. Another good thing about examples is they can often, when there's a complicated technical point, right? So sometimes you do get into technical something, you say, why does this equation have this side condition? You can say, it's because this example demonstrates why it's necessary, right? You can show an example that says, oh, now I see that the simple rule wouldn't work for that. Yeah.
Because, most of the time people seem to switch off, unless it's like a really technical conference.
So that's true. So this is let's see, what to leave out? I'm going to skip to a bit about what to leave out. So one thing to leave out is too much technical stuff, right? So this kind of slide, right? And then, people put up these kind of slides, you can see the audience going, oh, they sort of, reel back in their seats, right? And the trouble is that it makes them, it's a bit daunting. And unless they're really into this stuff, they're not reading this like this. They just makes them feel stupid, right? But they think, I don't understand this. The other people in the audience, very clever chaps, they all understand this, but I don't. I'm a mere worm. I will read my email, right? So you're absolutely right. And yet, right, I do think you want to get to some technical detail, right? So I find it deeply unsatisfying if a talk just says, well, you're not really clever enough to understand that, anything important, so I'm just going to give you some generalities. So what I would do with something like this is to pick, one of these rules, say, blow it up big and say, I'm just going to show you a little snapshot of a little corner of this system and how we think about it as it illustrates an interesting point. And then you may say, you could have this as a backup slide, or you just flash it past and you say, the interesting thing about this slide is that's the whole type system. It's in the paper, you can read it, but I think it's quite exciting that it fits on one slide. Right? Then that's a whole different thing. Do you see what I mean? So it's a balance. Definitely overwhelm them with this kind of stuff, but don't go to the other extreme of no technical stuff at all.
So you basically put another example.
Another example, yes, but in this case the example might be, so here, these are typing judgments, right? So I might pick one of them as an exemplary typing judgment, but then I might have some little programs that illustrate its operation, yeah. So it's turtles all the way down, Yeah. Okay, let's go back. How fast can this thing go back? Not very fast. Examples, yes. I'm going to skip this example because that was just another example of an example. Let's see. So this is good. What to leave out? This is even more important. So what are we going to put in? Quick reminder. What are we going to put in? Number 1? Motivation. Number 2? The key idea. Very good, right? Remember that. That's all you have to put in. And here's some things not to put in. This. How often do you see this at the beginning of the talk? Right? Early on in the talk, it seems like good scholarship, right? Speaker says, thank you for, I'm very pleased to be here, it's very exciting to be here, I've come a long way, etc., etc. Then they put, and here's a little outline of my talk. And then they sort of say, well, first I'm going to tell you about the Flugel system and then its shortcomings, and then I'm going to tell you about synthetic epimorphisms. And at this stage, you have no clue what Flugel is or what a synthetic epimorphism is. But because the speaker is, they're actually quite interested in this stuff, they can't resist adding a sentence or two about each of these points. Right? All of which is complete double dutch to the audience at that stage. Right? So it's like you're taking this precious 2 minutes at the beginning of your talk and you're just talking nonsense to them. Right? And it's unimaginably dire, and people do it a lot. Not universally. I would say maybe only about a third of talks do this, but don't. Yes.
Especially in fields like PL, when so much of the published material is so theoretical, how do you encourage the presence of pedagogical material that is focused on example?
How do you encourage how do you encourage pedagogical material focused on examples in a technical field?
Because PL
is that right?
so theory-based, and all the publications
programming language is very theory-based. But on the other hand, so here you are. So think about it this way. You're here giving a talk because you have written a paper maybe or been invited to give a talk about something that excites you, right? Somehow you're a PL person, right? So there's something about it that you think is interesting, right? What is it? Right? So somewhere in your heart, your beating heart, it says, this is something which is so important to me. I'm devoting years of my life to studying this stuff. All you have to do is to rip it out of your heart and show it to your audience, right? And I'm sure it isn't that it's highly technical. Wow, that's what I'm so excited about it. There's something else, right? So the technical stuff is a kind of support to something. For me, I'm a PL guy, programming languages guy too. I'm interested in functional programming, and I think functional programming is just a sort of radical and elegant attack on the entire enterprise of programming that I intend over the course of my career to upend the whole business of programming. Well, it may not work out like that, but at least it will be fun. And then, of course, there's plenty of technical stuff. If you're building a rocket, right, there's plenty of detailed technical stuff about how you make the rocket and how you make the spacecraft get into orbit around Jupiter, which it has, right? But then finally, the point is, it was excited that it got... you get the idea. I don't know. There's no easy answer. But go back to basics, I would say. But don't do outlines. No more outlines. It's okay to do a bit of orientation slides. So, you notice I have been putting up slides like this that tell the audience that I come to the end of a little bit, right? So actually, this could be a good place. If you've been, wanting to ask a question and not sure when, then, this could be a good moment. It's a sort of signpost. Sometimes people put up content slides like this. They don't make much of it. They just sort of go by quickly and they say, this is roughly where I am, right? So just as a quick, brief orientation about where people are in the talk, but don't do it at the beginning. And don't hesitate very long on it. Does that make sense? Have you You've been to talks that do this? And have you thought, wow, I'm going to stop reading my email and look at this content slide? You have not. Okay. Here's another thing. Oh, yes, go.
Every single time I do a talk that doesn't have one of those, my supervisor makes me add one in.
Okay, so tell your supervisor that Simon says that you shouldn't. It may not work, but you could try. Or the other thing is you do put it not at the beginning, put it after the motivation, right? So you got them motivated and hooked, and then briefly you're going to say, in my talk, and make a content slide that has 3 things on it, not 8, you know. And now I've sort of given you a bit of motivation. First, I'm going to show you the key idea. Then I'm going to say a little bit about how well it worked in practice. And you're on. You've taken 10 seconds, satisfied your supervisor, and moved on. But yeah.
There's a recording of this talk, right?
There is a recording of this talk. Yeah, that's right. You can point to the video. Send in the link. Yeah, go.
You go as far as forbid any overlap between what's written on screen and what you're saying. I get really irritated when someone has big blocks of text on their slides and then proceed to read.
Yes. So should you read? So reading your slides is not good. Absolutely. I would not go as far as to forbid any overlap. Right, because otherwise you think, well, now that you're going to kind of split brain thing, am I reading the slides and listening? So, and you'll get a lot of advice from the coaches about, how many words to put on slides and so forth. And people vary a lot in their styles. I tend to be a bit wordy, right? And with the other thing to try to avoid, if you can, is to, I'll say a bit more about this, is to treat your slides solely as a prompt for you. They can be useful in that way, but yeah, at all costs, do not just read the slides. That is important. Yeah. But you can have notes, that's fine. Yes, and so this will vary a lot between people. Some people will be fine without notes. Others will want to look at notes. Others will feel more able to move around. Just the important thing is to be relaxed about it. But it's much better if you can avoid reading your talk, right? That part, it's difficult to do that well. I mean, if you know your talk really well, you can have it completely scripted in front of you. But if you can avoid actually having to read off it, it's very helpful. I mean, this is another personality thing. It's quite difficult to just extemporize to begin with, but you'll get used to it. But if you're perceived to be fixed on a podium with your eyes on your talk, reading from your talk, that is just not an engaging way. You've got to try to avoid that if you can. Okay, let's see. What was this? Related work. Yes. What about related work? So sometimes this is not such a frequent sin, but it does happen that people can spend quite a lot of time talking about related work, which seems to be good scholarship, right? Worst of all, they can do this early in the talk, and that's terrible because it's even more technical than that content slide. Nobody understands what you're talking about except, the 3, Mr. XXB, right? He's very pleased, maybe, but that's all. So. But even putting it near the end uses that sort of precious moments of your talk. So rather than having a related work slide that really is only going to be appreciated or learnt from, how many of your audience are going to go away thinking, I'm really glad that that there was that slide about related work, right? Most of them are going to go away thinking, well, I'm really glad that person has done their good scholarship, and when I read the paper, I'm going to find out about the related work, it's going to cite all the relevant stuff. I'm really glad that when somebody asks a question about related work, they seem to absolutely know their field, right, and was able to respond in an able and articulate way. I'm really glad that when they said, yes, absolutely, we built on the work, the work that Martin Odersky did in Scala, which is pretty amazing, and, particularly, his treatment of, object-oriented programming or something. So, take the opportunity to speak well of your, as it were, competition, or more accurately, the shoulders, the giants on whose shoulders you are standing. But don't actually proactively force it down your audience's neck. Yes?
Wouldn't you say that adding the related work to the motivation section, because some of the related work might have motivated your current work. So saying that this and that happened, and so it's a very interesting idea, but blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, so good thought. But if you were the audience listening to that, put yourself in the receiving end, was it of direct interest to you who did it and why, right? What's of direct interest to the audience is the idea sequence. So you might say, well, here's a problem, our Java class files. A standard, you might think you could compress them with gzip. Well, everybody's heard of gzip. You might not then say, and the authors of gzip were so-and-so, right? And it was done in 1976. You might say, because the idea sequence is, there's some sort of generic compression technology, and then, but the idea in this talk is that maybe we could use language-aware compression technology. Do you see what I mean? And then in the paper, you cite chapter and verse for the competition. If somebody asks you about them, but the point, so you're trying to focus around the points that the audience is directly engaged with, interested in. So, and sometimes, just possibly, they will be, right? It may be that something is so blindingly obvious, it'll be absolutely in their minds. The standard tools that they use, you've got to mention them. Okay, let's see, we talked about technical detail, so we're going to omit it. One thing I forgot to say is, one thing that makes it difficult to omit technical detail is that you've invested so much in it yourself, right? It's drenched in your blood, right? That figure, right? You've been through 30 versions of that figure, and you can hardly bear not to show it to your audience. And yet you have to. Put it in the paper. So, but it is difficult, and I think that's probably the reason that that speakers sometimes overdo technical detail is because it's hard won to them, and they want to share something about it. But then again, think, what is it that I'm sharing? It's not really the technical detail itself; it's the insight that kind of led me there. See if you can extract the insight in some way. Okay, so far so good. So that's all about content. Anybody got any other observations or questions about content? Yeah.
So do you think it's a good structure to show a result and then a conclusion and then a new result and a conclusion, or best to show all your results and then one big conclusion at the end?
What's in a result and a conclusion? You mean what you've learnt from that result? Yeah, I suppose. What would you do if you were with a friend in in your office with a whiteboard? Would you show result, conclusion, or would you show result and little conclusion? Then for the kind of thing you're thinking of, what would you do?
I would show more conclusions then.
Yeah,
every little step I would do.
Yeah, you'd probably interleave them, wouldn't you? So I would. It's actually a good model. What would you do if you were just explaining it to a friend with a bit of paper on a whiteboard? Try to avoid thinking of your talk as a sort of formal entity and more as a kind of informal dialogue. Ideally, you get into a dialogue with the audience. Yeah.
Also, maybe pick the most important one, as you said, one idea, right?
Oh, pick the most important result. Yes, that's true. So yes, if you don't want to show too many things, but I think the force of your suggestion was you might have a key idea, but then you might say, well, one of the reasons it's a good idea is because it applies in situation X and situation Y and situation Z, right? So here's my, I applied it in situation X and this is what happened. So that's that would all be a sort of outworking of the key idea, as it were. Yeah. But yeah, you want to make sure they're still anchored to the key idea. Okay. Well, let's see. Well, this has been mentioned a couple of times, but by far the most important thing about presenting a talk is to sound as if that you are interested in it, right? That is, to be enthusiastic about it. And it's because if you don't appear to be excited by your talk, why will your audience be? Right? So this is really, this varies a lot between individuals. I'm a bit of a sort of exhibitionist, so it's not hard for me. And I know that some people find it much more difficult to look their audience in the eyes. But nevertheless, if you stand behind a podium and you say, well, I'm going to give this talk today. It's not very interesting. You probably won't really want to hear it, and you might want to read your email, but I'm going to give it anyway, so slide one. Then, and this is not what anybody actually says, but somehow subliminally, you get that message, and you've got to somehow just struggle with yourself to break out of that feeling. Everybody feels like a worm, right, that nobody will be interested in your talk. You've got to sort of break out of that and just share the sort of, the passion in your heart for what you're doing and with your audience. Yes?
So at MIT, there's this guy called Noam Chomsky.
Can everybody hear at the back? No, you're looking a bit. Yes, you can? Okay, keep speaking loudly.
I'll repeat myself. So
Yeah.
at MIT, there's a guy called Noam Chomsky. A lot of people might know about him. So he talks in the lowest of tones, and he's like so like almost mute, and he's not animated at all. But he's somebody that thousands flock in to listen to. So I think sometimes there are
Chomsky is kind of like God, so so he gets a free pass. So I would yes, there are counterexamples, right? And clearly, the things that he says, people have learned that the things he says are worth coming to regardless, right? But nevertheless, it's a kind of, it's like enthusiasm makes people dramatically more receptive. So it's like, think of your audience like sunflowers, right? They're all, sunflowers at night, kind of like this. And the sun comes out and they all come up like this and they become sort of receptive to the sun. So enthusiasm literally makes audiences do that. They look at you, they smile, they become more open, and they become vastly more receptive to the ideas. Now, of course, the ideas may be no good, right? And it's possible that, the ideas are so good that even the most sort of droopy audiences will nevertheless absorb something. But you might as well give yourself the best chance. Was there somebody else? Yes?
So, what would you recommend, standing or moving around?
Personally, I would strongly recommend moving around.
And what happens if the conference format is, there's the desk, you sit there and you click on your laptop?
So if the conference format is that he's there and you sit and you click on your laptop, make strenuous efforts to say, I'm not going to do that. Right? So for a start, always bring your own wireless gizmo so that you're not tied to your laptop. And secondly, that very, very occasionally they say, we're recording this, our camera is fixed, you must stand here. That's very rare, actually. Usually they're not recording you. And even if they are, there's somebody who can point the camera. So make strenuous effort to be allowed to move around. Yeah, the microphone's the other thing. You really want a wireless mic if you possibly can, yeah.
Yeah, often the microphone is like fixed.
Yes,
so
that is a struggle. But then, so I would, so it's a judgment. Even without a microphone, I would try the room and see, can you hear me at the back when I'm speaking without a microphone? Because I bet you could probably hear me without a microphone in this room. It's fine. And for the scale of talks you're probably going to be doing for the immediate future, that would probably be fine. But I mean, it's up to you, right? So, but the key thing is, I think you could give an extremely engaging, enthusiastic, motivating talk standing completely fixed in place, right? This isn't the be-all and end-all. It's just that I personally find it easier to move around. Yeah.
Well, because I've been told used to like to walk around as well, but I've been told to not walk so much because then they look at you walking instead of the.
Which off-putting. Well, yeah. It's always a balance. If I was doing handstands, you'd stop thinking about the talk. You'd think about something else. So it's a balance. I don't think. I walk around a lot. Maybe people are just being very polite, but nobody's told me recently that merely walking around. There was one person I know, it was Roger Needham, actually, who was our lab director, and he would do this, and that sort of repeatedly during the entire talk. That was a little bit distracting, I have to say. He was a great computer scientist, also.
He would also stand behind you when he talked to you. That's how he said it.
He might not have stood on the chair. So yes, one reason I like moving around is that it's giving a talk is a stressful activity, and physically moving helps loosen you up actually. So it makes it easier, I find. Okay, let's see. So I said write the slides the night before here, and I don't quite mean that because I often. I did used to do that, and actually nowadays I find that I often write some slides during a previous talk because there's a talk and I think, that's kind of interesting. I wonder if I could modify this talk a little bit. And nowadays you can do that with PowerPoint. It's great. I come from the days when we actually had to handwrite slides on acetates and had overhead projectors. But the important thing is that you need to be familiar with them, right? So it's perfect if you never actually have to look at your slides at all because you just know what the next slide is. Right, so the antithesis of that is when you spend the entire talk doing this. You say, this very interesting rule over here, and you point. You have your back to the audience the whole time. Now, again, that's an extreme version, but your goal is to be eyeballing your audience almost all the time. Just occasionally, you may need to say, this particular point on this particular, look at this particular equation. And then you can turn around, but try to avoid doing that. Okay, Another thing that often happens in talks, it's almost subliminal, is people kind of apologize for something. They say, you know, I was delayed on my travel here, or my laptop crashed last night, or it's probably not a very interesting talk, or, you know, there's something negative about what they're doing. Sometimes it reflects something that really has happened. You know, they really didn't get any sleep last night, or they really were sick last night, or they really are jet lagged. But don't share that with your audience, right? Because they, while they might be sympathetic, there's nothing they can do to help you at that point, right, other than look attentive. So it doesn't set you up to be in a good place. So just never apologize, right? No matter how bad things are, don't apologize to your audience. Just keep going. You're good, right? Because otherwise it leaves them as an audience member. If somebody's apologizing to it, you just don't know what to do with yourself, right? You've got no way to respond, and so that's not good. As an individual, that's quite different, right? But in a group setting, it's not so good. Now, of course, there are physical things, right? So when you're sitting here, you know, and the previous speaker is, you know, just winding up their talk, and you're sitting there and you're thinking, I'm actually not sure that I'm physically going to be able to stand up. You know, you're kind of breathing fast, and you know, you can feel a kind of tremor, and you think, will my legs actually work? I've sat there and I've really thought that. I thought, am I going to be able to physically stand on the stage, or will I simply collapse? It's very unsettling. But I've seen very, very few people collapse on the stage. It's quite rare. So actually, it works out that you can stand. So the it is a worry, but it usually doesn't turn out to be as bad. So here are the things that I do. One is that you know, do the sort of usual deep breathing kind of things. Another thing that I find helpful is for the very beginning of the talk, that first few sentences, right, at which the host has introduced you, and like searchlights, 150 eyes swivel and are fixed on you, right? That moment you're like the rabbit in the headlights. That is a good moment to have an exact script for what you're going to say, right? That just gets you off to a good start. Usually once you're going, things are okay. So when I said about reading a script, I would have that actually memorized, right? To know how you're going to start. So you have a strong start that you feel confident about. And then you're away. Yeah, I've said the other things already. Yes, please.
Do you think about jokes to start a presentation?
Start with a joke. So I think this is very personal. I would not recommend starting with a joke. I think it's, if you're the kind of person who can tell jokes naturally, that's great, and then go for it. But I would be cautious about, as it were, reading up on jokes and thinking I'm going to start with a joke. Sort of, kind of like if it comes naturally to you, fine. If it doesn't, it's a technical presentation, right? It's not an after-dinner talk, if you like. That's another medium. Yes.
So what about some situation where we have to apologize for something, and you can tell it in a joking way, that you can actually do both things at the same time?
Can you give an example?
I've seen the talks, and sometimes it's good. Like the audience laughed, and we forgot about everything that caused this apology.
So I should say, I mean, humor is great, right? That if you can get your audience to laugh, that is fantastic. It's just that it's hard to do by trying, if you see what I mean. So that it kind of, so I don't think for me, it doesn't come under the heading of a simple, actionable idea. It's more something you might go into. But yes, sometimes people very naturally and in a kind of relaxed way can turn a tricky situation into something people laugh at, and that's so brilliant when they do that. But I don't know how to turn that into an actionable point. Yeah.
What happens if you brick or if you freeze? How do you get?
Oh, what happens if you freeze up altogether? Right. So at that point, your slides really are quite helpful. Right. You really can look at your slides and say, sort of get yourself back on track. What am I trying to say? So yes, try not to say to the audience, I've completely forgotten what I was going to say. But you can have silences, right? It's okay simply to stop and just have a moment, a moment's pause while you regroup. They're not going to, if you stop for, a whole minute, they're going to get a bit restive. But simply pausing is okay. And then you can just sort of, so don't apologize, just pause, look at your slides, check where you are, regroup. Okay, we talked about facing your audience and not pointing. I have seen people pointing at their laptop, which is hilarious. It doesn't that very much. Usually they point, but even pointing at the screen is pretty dodgy, right? Because it means that you're forced to put your back to the audience, and that means you're not watching them for questions. You're not really engaged with them. So while a laser pointer can be a useful thing, don't use it too much. And it's a slightly dangerous thing too, because if you are a little anxious, then it turns into sort of Lissajous figures. It amplifies the shaking of your hand, and so you get little figures of 8 on the screen. So it kind of can be a bit not good in that way. Let's see. Now, it's quite good to so we want to make eye contact with your audience, and it's quite helpful to identify somebody in your audience, or maybe 1 or 2 people who nod. Some people instinctively nod as the as the talk goes along. Some people just sort of sit there impassively, and it doesn't mean they're not paying attention or not interested. It's just their natural body language. But others, do more sort of instinctive nodding. And some of you have been doing that, right? So you have been asking, what's your name? Yeah, that's right. Mozart. No, that's you. That's right. Yes. So you've been asking questions as well, right? But you nod a bit, and the nodders are quite useful. If you can find somebody who's doing that, people while they're following, they'll sort of nod, but when they get lost, they stop nodding, right? So it's great. so you can sort of kind of say, oh, so is anybody lost here? Because sometimes when material's getting a little technical, it's a good idea to do a check and say, it would really help me if somebody asked a question. You would say, Rob, how's it going? Did you understand that? So if you can identify somebody in the audience you actually know. So, of course, by watching the audience, you can also keep an eye out for questions. And for me, in formal conference formats, it's always give the talk, questions at the end. Everything else, I'd strongly encourage you to look for questions during the talk. In fact, I've got, this is what this slide is about. So if your audience is willing to engage you in some dialogue during the talk, that is a huge victory, right? If they sit there respectfully until the end and then ask you, 1 or 2 questions, that might be okay, but it's not nearly so great as when they made comments and questions during the talk. As you've been doing. Yes, go.
What is your preferred approach of dealing with antagonistic questions or questions that are designed to show off some audience members' knowledge?
So this does happen. So sometimes, yes, you get the sort of troll kind of questions who are really kind of derailing your talk. So it's comparatively rare in my experience, right? But it's why you might feel anxious about questions. And so I think, stage 1 is you just respond in a constructive way. When they start to become persistent, you then say, there's plenty I could say in response to that question, but if I respond at length, we won't get to the rest of the talk. And there's some key ideas I really want to get to. Can we talk at the end? And then if you're really struggling, then that's when you start eyeballing your session chair and sort of making signs of distress, because they should rescue you, right? If somebody's being really aggressive. But in my experience, it's vanishingly rare. Maybe different things happen in different cultures too. Yeah.
So if you take questions in the middle of your talk, how do you deal with when like the 5 or 10% of people that really know your work ask technical questions?
Same thing. You have to just say, so it's a balance. You've got them in a dialogue. You say, you clearly know what you're talking about, and there's tons in the paper, but I'm keen to get to the key idea that's in a couple of slides' time. So you can just say you want to stay in control. In other words, you want to be responsive, but nevertheless somehow in control. So I think it's okay sometimes, particularly in a less formal talk. Let's say you're giving a seminar in your department, or you're visiting somebody else's department and giving a talk. Well, then, even truncating your talk, not doing some of the material, but engaging in a dialogue is way better than shutting everything down and saying, I'm just going to stick to my script. It really annoys me when people are totally dismissive of questions. They sort of blow you off very quickly because you feel they've got their thing they want to say, and then really not very interested in you, the audience, right? They just want to say their thing. Right, that's annoying. So, if you, as in all things, it's a balance. But for me, I would err on the side of following the questioner rather than blowing them off until it goes too far. That's a balance. Yes, right at the back.
Do you have any advice for what you should do if you realize that maybe 80% of your audience is lost halfway through your talk?
What do you do if 80% of your audience is lost? Well, so again, it depends a little bit on the circumstances. If it was a departmental seminar, I'd more or less, if I really thought that my audience was getting lost, I'd sort of stop and see if I could do sort of whiteboardy kind of things or find out where they were lost. Because the truth is, very little, the world is not made a better place by you finishing your talk and having 20 people who just haven't understood anything of it. It's better just not to finish your talk. So, I mean, there'll come a point when you're listening to talks, there'll be a point when you may think, well, this isn't in my area. I was engaged in the beginning, and now it's got too technical, and I'm going to disconnect. That happens to me a lot, particularly when I'm going to interview talks in other areas. And that's so for the speaker at that point, I wouldn't want them to think, oh, I've got to stop and deal with Simon, right? So because there's a kind of, the talk is framed with a particular technical point, right? And if you can't get to it at all, you'd be stuck. So, but if everybody's lost, I'd stop. And it's easier to know that in small groups. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of connected question. But what is the good ways of repeating and refreshing the ideas that you already told about? And is it really a good idea to repeat something?
Is it a good idea to repeat something? I suppose, well, talks don't give you much of a chance to repeat because they're quite short, typically. So I would typically do repetition like that by way of examples. Here's another example that illustrates the same idea, and here's another example that illustrates the same idea. So you're not repeating yourself, you're just exercising the idea. That would be sort of primary way to start. Yeah, Bob.
What's your approach to truncating a talk? So say you've started, and there's been lots of questions, and you're halfway through your material, and you still have some key points to get through.
Well, you have to take a strategic choice. You say, okay, so here we are. It's a half-hour talk, and we've had quite a lot of questions, and we're 22 minutes have gone. But there are two things I really want to show you. Can we just pause and do that? And then you probably you must skip. You might need to skip a little bit to get to them, right? So you've told your audience that you are adapting to them, right? That there are some things you want to get to because you think it will be of interest to them, but you're not just racing through your material at twice the speed, I guess.
Do you think it's worth building points into your presentation beforehand where you can
say,
if
you can plan for that a bit, yeah. So building escape routes, you say I could stop here is actually very helpful if you can do that. Yeah.
So when you're responding to questions, should you at all costs avoid starting your answer with, well, that's a very good question, or is that
I don't know. So the question is, should you avoid saying that's a great question? No, I think it can be quite a nice thing to, if you say it every time, then it gets a bit, but often audience members feel quite tentative about asking questions. They feel worm-like too. You are the person who knows what they're talking about, so they may be quite tentative. So if you convey, that was a really stupid question, and how could you possibly have thought of asking me that? That would be bad, right? So you want to convey that, and maybe once or twice you can actually say it. Does it annoy you when people do that?
I just sometimes feels as if so I guess some people might use it as a pause to kind of think about the question, which I guess is fair enough, but sometimes it does feel almost technical.
Almost what?
It feels almost as if it's some sort of tag on the beginning of every single...
Or sort of formulaic, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, avoid being formulaic, yeah.
Some people just repeat the question to start thinking.
Yes, that is probably a better thing to do. I've been doing a bit of that, right? So it's quite often audience members, other audiences from far away have not even heard the question. So repeating the question would be quite a constructive thing to do. It also lets you rephrase it in a way that, I think you're asking this, right? And that gives the question a chance to say, no, that wasn't what I was asking at all. But sometimes people ask the most obscure things. Haven't forgotten. Yes. What do you do if they don't know the answer? So, if you don't know the answer, then it's better not to flannel. I mean, it is difficult. If you have no clue, then you just have to say. They say, but a classic is, but didn't Strunk and Boodle do this? What about their WizWaz system? And you just have to say, I've got a clue. I've never heard of them, right? Let alone the WizWaz system. You just have to say, that's really interesting. I don't know about that. Can you tell me? Give me a pointer to it afterwards. There's no two ways about it. If you just waffle, and sort of people will detect it. It's better just to bite the bullet, I think. Yeah.
Do you practice a lot?
Do I practice a lot? Oh, before? Yeah, so I think it's yes, it's a very good idea to do a sort of a complete dry run of your talk, so you won't get any questions, you know, in your bathroom. Just to check for length. Length is quite difficult to judge in advance. People go through slides at very, very different rates. I typically have quite a lot of slides, but still get through them. You're about to see an example of truncation. It's 10:29. But yes, rehearsal, good idea. Preferably with a friend. It helps to do it with a friend. Okay, so there are are there any key points that we have missed? I'm going to just want to, in the last 30 seconds, tell you two things. One, being a good audience member, so you're being good audience members, so this is the other side of the coin, right? Be the person who asks the questions. I can't tell you how often that you have whole audiences that are completely lost, and they're just desperately wishing that somebody would say, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about, can you please say that again in a clearer way? But then none of them are brave enough to do it, so you can be that person. So, and do that early. Don't wait till very late, right? And then you betrayed the fact the last 20 minutes has been completely wasted, right? So as soon as you get lost, start asking questions. And then at some point it'll become clear that, you know, you're not, you know, there may come a point when you have to stop just because you're aware that you're going to become that questioner who's derailing the talk. Let's see. Just let me mention, do not do this, right? That's really annoying. And this is also really annoying. This is also really annoying? Yes, right. So the revealing points one by one, I hate that. It annoys me, right? Because it makes me think, me think the speaker didn't really trust me. Okay. You must stop. This is what I'm about to do. Because when it comes to be 10:30, you're still sitting there quite politely, but when audiences expect the talk to stop, they somehow stop listening. So if you go on, right, then they will, nothing goes in. So it's a complete waste of time. And your host gets restive. And then I've seen people, you know, they're 5 minutes over, they're on slide, you can see in the corner of their slide, you know, 22 out of 60, and they look at their host and they say, I've just got a few more slides, would that be okay? And the host, you know, the audience are looking at the host and going, and the host says, well, yes, that would be lovely. So, please finish, and we shall.
Thank you very much.
So we could take a couple more questions, and I'm sure Simon will volunteer
I'm going to be around
to
during coffee, and I'm around actually all week, and I'll be back on Friday.
So any questions you want to wrap up?
Or comments and observations, too, from your experience. Yeah.
One thing about rehearsing is that it's sort of, so the danger is that it sometimes makes you sound like you're not making things on the spot, and so it sounds like you rehearsed, and it sounds more robotic. Why, you know?
You mean if you over-rehearse, then you might sound robotic. I think a couple of run-throughs will not make you sound robotic, right? 50 run-throughs might make you sound robotic. So I do it a bit, but not script every line.
Would you pause on purpose?
Would I what?
Pause on purpose.
Would I pause on purpose?
Exactly. So
Oh, yes. I think I would. So I haven't done this very much today, but I think if you think at that point in my talk, I'll just pause for a moment. You know, I'll look at the audience. You could even say, okay, has anybody got any questions at this point? At this point, you're regrouping. Yes, absolutely. So planning some pauses, I think, would be good.
So final question here?
Yeah, here we go in the middle.
But eye contact. You should only eye contact a few people or many.
Oh, eye contact, super important, yes. Look people in the eyes. With a few or many, like I said, picking a few that you look at occasionally, but if you just look at one person all the time, they get a bit, they sort of, suddenly, you know, what is it? So if you just, so you want to pick, you know, several if you're going to eyeball some particular people, but the big thing is look at your audience, not at your feet, not at the slides, at them.
Maybe a trick for that, put your friends at different spots in the
Oh, that's right, you can look at your friends, they won't feel so, yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Cool,
thank you very
All right,
much,
coffee
Simon.
time. We'll talk over coffee. Thanks.